Mm-hmm.
Well, let's jump right into something pretty surprising. The way poetry and digital technology are starting to connect.
Yeah, it's more than just reading poems on a screen, isn't it?
Exactly. We're talking about computers actually getting involved in creating the poetry.
Precisely. And the sources you've been looking at really highlight this shift. They show how these digital tools aren't just for sharing poems anymore.
Right.
They're becoming part of the creative process itself, sparking totally new kinds of poetic expression.
So our mission today, essentially, is to explore these new ways human language and computer language are kind of merging.
Yeah, merging to create these novel forms of poetry. It's quite fascinating.
Okay, so let's start with generative poetry. This is where it gets really interesting, I think.
Definitely.
You have computer programs, right? Algorithms, basically, that are churning out poetic text.
Using databases of words and phrases that someone has curated.
So it's not a person writing line by line.
Yeah.
It's instructions and data coming together.
And what's really compelling is how the poet's role changes.
So.
Well, instead of writing the poem directly, the poet becomes more like a designer.
I go with that.
They design the system, choose the raw materials, the words, the phrases, and then the algorithm generates the poem based on those rules.
We've got a solid example here. Dial by Latza Fan and Nick Montfort.
Mm-hmm.
This one feels like messages going back and forth online between two people who are isolated.
Right. It captures that feeling of networked communication, but also distance.
Yeah. And what jumped out at me was the use of emojis. And you could even click on these little clocks to sort of adjust the time within the poem itself.
That interaction is key.
And it can run forever, or you can set it for a certain time or a certain number of runs. It's like the poem has its own internal clock.
That manipulation of time, it makes it really dynamic, doesn't it? The poem isn't static. It unfolds, it changes, it makes you question if a literary work has to be fixed or if it can be inherently fluid,
That's a good point. There's another piece that really made me stop and think. Say Their Names.
Yeah.
By John Barber.
Ah, yes.
It's web-based. And it generates this list over 5,000 names.
Names of Black, Hispanic, and Native Americans killed by U.S. police from 2015 onwards.
And the piece is very clear. It makes no judgment on guilt or innocence. It just presents the names.
Right.
But what was really striking, or maybe unsettling, was the computer voice reading the names. It's described as having this sometimes almost cheerful tone.
And that contrast is powerful. The sheer weight of the subject matter versus the detached, sometimes incongruously upbeat computer voice.
Yeah.
It's raw data presentation almost. It strips away the usual emotional framing and just lays the names bare.
It's strange how an algorithm, which has no emotion, can end up creating such a strong emotional response in the reader or listener.
Exactly. The lack of human inflection forces you to supply the emotional weight. It's quite effective in a stark way.
Okay. Moving on from generative, let's talk about remixed poetry. This idea really resonates, taking something that exists and building on it.
Right. It's like literary adaptation, but often using code as the foundation.
You keep the underlying structure.
But change the content, the vocabulary to create something new. It highlights how innovation often comes from reinterpreting existing forms.
And the perfect example seems to be Nick Montfort's Taroko Gorge.
Definitely a seminal piece in this area.
He visited Taroko Gorge in Taiwan, this beautiful place, and thought, instead of just writing a poem about it.
Why not make a program that generates poems in the spirit of it?
Exactly. So he created this generator for minimalist nature-type poems.
And then this is where the remixing comes in. Scott Retberg took Montfort's actual code.
The program itself.
Yeah, Montfort made the code available, kind of like open source software. Retberg took that code and just swapped out the vocabulary list.
Oh, okay.
So instead of nature words, he plugged in words related to urban life, cars, technology, and the result was Tokyo Garage.
So you go from minimalist nature to...
maximalist urban sprawl, basically. Using the exact same poetic engine. It's a brilliant illustration of the concept.
It really is, like using the same blueprint for a cabin versus a skyscraper.
A good analogy, yeah.
And it didn't stop there, did it? J.R. Carpenter did something similar.
Right. Carpenter swapped in words related to eating, creating another variation.
So this sharing of the code really sparked a lot of creativity.
Absolutely. The sources say there are dozens of Taroko Gorge remixes out there. Because the code is accessible, anyone can try making their own version.
That accessibility seems important in digital poetry.
It really is. It lowers the barrier to creating and experimenting. Even just messing with the code becomes a kind of creative act itself.
Okay, let's shift gears to visual verse. Combining words and images isn't new, of course.
No, you can go way back. William Blake, illuminated manuscripts.
Right. But digital tools seem to open up new, more dynamic ways to do this.
For sure. It moves beyond just static pictures on a page. You get interaction, movement.
A good example mentioned is Qiangxin Chen's Shanshui.
Mm-hmm. And the title itself has layers of meaning.
Yeah, mountain and water in Chinese, but also landscape and traditional Chinese landscape painting and the poetry associated with them.
A lot packed in there.
And in Chen's piece, every time you click, you get a new poem, right? And a new corresponding landscape painting generated alongside it.
Yes, the poem and image are born together in that moment, constantly changing, constantly regenerating.
That interactivity again. Each click feels like an act of creation.
It really emphasizes poetry as an experience, not just a fixed object.
Then there's Meredith Morin's The Buoy. This sounds quite different. It's called poetic autofiction.
Yes, and it uses diagrams, almost like a new kind of language.
To talk about complex political issues, identity.
Marginalized identities specifically. It mixes these abstract visuals, performance elements, even PowerPoint slides.
Wow, PowerPoint poetry.
It sounds unconventional, but it's used to explore indirectly a personal history growing up queer in Texas.
So using multiple modes together, visuals, text, performance.
Exactly. Morin is really pushing at the edges of what we even call poetry. Using visuals so deliberately creates layers of meaning that text alone might not capture.
It makes you think about how much the visual side can shape how we connect with the poem.
Definitely.
Okay, next up, video game poem plays.
Yeah.
This made me immediately think of those old text adventure games.
Like Zork. Yes, there's a clear lineage there.
But digital poets are taking that interactivity in really different directions.
Absolutely. Video games offer this inherently interactive space that's ripe for poetic exploration. The reader or player gets involved in a much more active way.
Jason Nelson's work is mentioned, specifically game, and again game.
Nelson's work often blends these categories.
He calls it a digital poem, a retro game, an anti-design statement, and a personal exploration, all at once.
Quite a mix.
And what's interesting is how it breaks from normal game design. You're not trying to win or get a high score.
No, the goal isn't competition. It's more about navigating this kind of chaotic, overwhelming, but ultimately poetic atmosphere.
So the gameplay itself becomes contemplative.
You could say that. Nelson subverts game mechanics. The lack of clear goals, the fragmented text, it forces you into a different kind of engagement. The interaction is the poetic experience.
And then taking immersion even further, there's Mesbreeze's Viriyettes, using virtual reality.
Yes, VR microstories. You can use a headset or navigate it in a 3D browser window.
Stepping right inside the poem, essentially.
Pretty much. Each piece combines poetic text, these 3D models, and atmospheric sound.
How do you navigate?
You can click on annotations to move between points or just explore the 3D space freely.
That sounds incredibly immersive.
It really is. VR opens up huge potential, combining visuals, sound, text, and spatial navigation. It can be a very visceral, multi-sensory way to experience poetry. It blurs the lines between reading, exploring, and almost inhabiting the poem.
Okay, one last category. Coded messages, or code poetry. This sounds really intriguing.
It is. It's literally merging classical poetic ideas with computer programming languages.
So poems written in Python or JavaScript?
For instance, yes, like the ones in Ishak Bertrand's code poems. What's key here is that these poems, as written text, don't necessarily need a computer to exist.
But they use computer languages.
Exactly. And to really understand them, to appreciate them fully, you actually need to be able to read and understand the code itself.
That demands a whole different kind of literacy, doesn't it?
It does.
The source material drew a parallel to, say, trying to appreciate certain Russian or Chinese poems without knowing the original language.
That's a great comparison. The code isn't just delivering the message. The structure, the syntax, the logic of the code itself is part of the poem's meaning. It's aesthetic.
So the computer language becomes the poetic medium.
Precisely. It challenges our ideas about what poetic language can be and who the audience is.
Okay, so just to recap, we've touched on 5 main areas here. Generative poetry, where algorithms create.
Remixed poetry, building on existing code and structures.
Visual verse, that dynamic blend of image and text.
Video game poem plays, focusing on interactivity.
And finally, coded messages, where the computer language is the poem.
Right. And I think the big takeaway from all of this is that digital tech isn't just a passive platform for poetry anymore.
No, it seems like an active partner.
An active partner in creation, absolutely. This mix of human ideas and computer processes is leading to this incredible diversity of new poetic forms. Really surprising stuff.
It definitely makes you wonder, how did these new forms challenge our old ideas about authorship, you know, about creativity itself, and what language even is in this digital age?
Those are the big questions, aren't they?
Yeah. And thinking ahead, as technology keeps evolving and getting even more tangled up with how we express ourselves, what other kinds of poetry might be out there, forms we can't even really picture yet?
It's exciting and maybe a little daunting to think about what comes next.